Hey, peace. What's happening, everyone? On our deal with.
Ooh, yeah. Nah, nah, nah.
Suddenly there came a sound from heaven, as of a rushing mighty wind, like the rushing of a mighty wind, like the rushing of a mighty wind. Come and fill our hearts again, like the rushing of a mighty wind.
Yeah, blessings. Once again, the routine, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. All of that helps. So you don't know. Without any further ado, let's get started. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about today is as certainly as FBA wants to claim Black for themselves, they also want to take claim for the worst atrocity in history. That's what they want to state claim for. So that's the next thing I really want to talk about. Do they really have a case to say that their history of slavery and oppression is worse than everybody else's? Because that's something that they literally claim. And what they do in order to make that claim is they have to add on to slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, and things like that happened after slavery. And they think that makes theirs a lot worse. But from the reading that I did about the AU and their Global Reparations Fund, from that reading, I realized that the AU and Caribbean countries are not just asking for reparations for slavery either. They're also asking for reparations for colonialism. So it's slaves. So where in America, it's slavery and Jim Crow and everything else. In the Caribbean and Africa, their reparations movement is about slavery and colonialism. Okay, so I think, given conversations that I've had, it's clear to me that it was better to be a slave in America than in the Caribbean. Right? So the slavery that was experienced, just the slavery alone that was experienced in America, was not as harsh as the slavery in the Caribbean. The slaves in the Caribbean had a way shorter life expectancy than slaves in the Americas. America has been a better standard of living for Black people than at all points in its history, even during slavery. So that's what we're here to compare. We're here to compare those two things. And we're going to talk about colonialism and just see whether or not the colonialism that was experienced in the Caribbean, maybe even Africa as well, whether that colonialism is on par with the post-slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, white supremacy, systemic racism that was experienced, or that Blacks in America claim to experience. So we're just going to try and do a comparison of both of those. So, I'm going to keep going until somebody hits the link, but I'm in a reading mood. So I'll read for a little bit and then see what happens. So the first question I asked ChatGPT is, what is colonialism? And it says, colonialism is a system of domination in which one country establishes control over another territory, its people, and resources. It usually involves political rule, economic exploitation, cultural domination, and social restructuring imposed by the colonizing power. Key features of colonialism: political control. The colonializing nation imposes its government, laws, and authority over the colonized region, often dismantling local systems of governance. 2. Economic exploitation. Colonizers extract wealth through land, labor, minerals, or trade from the colony for the benefit of the mother country. This often included slavery, forced labor, and resource extraction. 3. Cultural domination. Colonizers often sought to impose their language, religion, and cultural values while devaluing or suppressing indigenous cultures and traditions. 4. Settlement and displacement. In some cases, like in the Americas, Australia, and parts of Africa, colonizers settled permanently, displacing or marginalizing the native population. Historical examples: European colonialism in the 15th and 20th centuries. Spain and Portugal colonized much of Latin America. Britain and France colonized large parts of Africa and Asia. Settler colonialism. In North America, Australia, and South Africa, colonizers established permanent settlements, often displacing native peoples. The effects: colonialism reshaped global trade, politics, and societies. It left lasting legacies: economic inequality, cultural hybridization, political borders, racial hierarchies, and struggles for independence. I mean, are those things on par with what happened in North America? Economic inequality, cultural hybridization, political borders, racial hierarchies, struggles for independence. Are those legacies of colonialism as harsh as the legacies of Jim Crow? I'm just asking the question. It says some scholars distinguish between colonialism, direct political and economic control, and imperialism, broader domination, including indirect influence. So, the two are kind of different. So the next question I asked ChatGPT, so that is the type of stuff. The next question I asked ChatGPT is, was the Caribbean colonized after slavery ended? And it says, great question. Let's break it down, because colonization and slavery, while closely connected, didn't end at the same time in the Caribbean. Timeline of Caribbean colonization and slavery. 1942 onward, European colonization of the Caribbean began with Columbus's arrival, first by Spain and later by Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Colonies were established long before slavery expanded. 19th to the 16th centuries, enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean to work on plantations. The wealth of the colonies depended on slavery. Slavery abolition dates. Britain in 1834. Apprenticeship until 1838. So Britain abolished slavery in 1834. France in 1848. The Netherlands in 1863, with a 10-year transition period in Suriname until 1873. And Spain in 1886 in Cuba, and 1873 in Puerto Rico. I wonder if America is the only country that went to war to end slavery. I think America is the only country that went to war to end slavery. I think that means a lot. I'm not sure what it means yet, but I think that that means and says a lot. Colonialism after slavery. Even after slavery ended, colonial rule continued for more than a century in most Caribbean islands. Freedom from slavery did not equal independence. In the British colonies, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and others remained under British rule until the mid-20th century. Jamaica, for example, only gained independence in 1962. French colonies, Guadeloupe and Martinique are still French territories today. Dutch colonies, Suriname gained independence in 1975. Curaçao and Aruba are still part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Spanish colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico, were Spain's last Caribbean colonies until the Spanish-American War in 1898. U.S. control. After 1898, Puerto Rico and Guam became U.S. territories. The U.S. occupied Cuba until 1902, with lasting influence. Key point: the Caribbean was colonized long before slavery, and colonialism lasted long after slavery ended. Slavery was one institution within colonial rule, but the colonial system, political control, economic dependency, and cultural domination persisted until the 20th century, and in some cases still exists. So as surely as Black Americans after slavery had sharecropping and Jim Crow and the Black Codes and redlining, mass incarceration, white supremacy, systemic racism, as surely as the Black Americans had those things to deal with up until the 20th century, and it's even said to be going on today. Surely as that's true, it is also true that in the Caribbean, there has been colonialism. After slavery, there has been colonialism, which persisted up to the 20th century and even is said to be happening today. So whose oppression was worst? Is colonialism easier to handle than Jim Crow? Is the economic inequality that's brought about by colonialism, is that economic inequality, is that easier to deal with than the economic inequality brought about by Jim Crow? I'm not so sure. Next thing I asked ChatGPT, how were Caribbean countries oppressed under colonialism after slavery ended? And I think I just wanted to get a little more in depth into exactly what happened, not a broad definition of what colonialism is and what happens, but I wanted to know distinctively within the Caribbean, how were the Caribbean islands affected by colonialism, just to kind of continue making that comparison. And ChatGPT says, excellent follow-up. The end of slavery in the Caribbean, 1830s to 1880s, depending on empire, did not mean true freedom. Colonial powers continued to oppress Caribbean societies in political, economic, and cultural ways. Here's a breakdown. And just to be, clear, those are the same ways that Black Americans claim to have been affected by Jim Crow and everything else, politically, economically, and culturally. And colonialism here is affecting Caribbean folks in the same way. Political oppression, no self-rule. Even after emancipation, Caribbean colonies were governed directly from London, Paris, and Amsterdam. Local assemblies existed in some places, but governors appointed by Europe had the final say. Limited political rights. Freed black and mixed race populations had very restricted voting rights, often tied to property ownership, literacy, or income, barriers designed to exclude the majority. Freed black and mixed race populations had very restricted voting rights, often tied to property ownership, literacy, or income, barriers designed to exclude the majority. Isn't that what I mean? Next, suppression of dissent. Uprisings, worker protests, or nationalist movements were often crushed. For example, Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in 1865 was violently put down by the British. Strikes in Trinidad and Barbados in the 1930s led to massacres by colonial troops. I wonder, when was a rebellion in America crushed by massacres by the American government? When did the American government massacre people that were rebelling? No, not people that were rebelling. Sorry, they weren't even rebelling. They were on strike. They were striking. When was a rebellion violently put down in America? When was the last time that happened? I don't know. What's his name? No, what's his name? Nat Turner? Maybe. So the next thing, economic oppression, plantation economy. The plantation economy maintained. After slavery, freed people often had little choice but to return to plantations for low wages. Oh, wait a minute. What's that called again? They call that something. Somebody tell me what they call that. Sharecropping? Isn't that what that is? In America, sharecropping? Isn't that the same thing that they're saying happened in the Caribbean? After slavery, freed people often had little choice but to return to plantations for low wages. Land remained in the hands of white elites or absentee European landlords. That's that sharecropping. Isn't that sharecropping or something? Somebody, is that sharecropping? Okay. Indentured labor importation. Britain imported workers from India from 1838 to 1917 and other regions to replace slave labor, keeping wages low and creating divisions among workers. That sounds like what happened in America. Yeah, it does. Indentured labor importation. Is there indentured labor going on in America? Could it have been to keep wages low? Could it have been to keep wages low like it was in the Caribbean? I wonder. Exploitation of resources. Profits from sugar, bananas, bauxite, and other exports flowed to Europe while the colonies remained poor. Ain't that something? And last, taxation without benefits. Colonies were heavily taxed, but funds largely served colonial administration, not local development. So again, this all sounds very similar to what they say is the legacy of Jim Crow and redlining and white supremacy and systemic racism and the whole shebang. So how is what happened in America? any worse than what the Caribbean people experienced. Black American descendants of slaves did not have a rougher go at it than Caribbean folks. Not during slavery, and not after slavery. Not before, not during, and not after slavery did y'all have it better than us, or better than anyone else. So if a part of your claim to be the only blacks, is the fact that your oppression was unique, sorry to burst your bubble. Really sorry to burst your bubble. So the next piece, social and cultural oppression. It says racial hierarchies. Although slavery ended, colonial society maintained white supremacy. Uh-oh, look at that. White supremacy in the Caribbean. White supremacy in the Caribbean. White supremacy in the Caribbean. Lighter-skinned populations often had more privilege and access to education or jobs. Who are these lighter-skinned people? Let me see. By lighter-skinned, can we replace lighter-skinned with copper-skinned? I believe we can. Were these the lighter-skinned descendants of the elites? Or were these the lighter-skinned descendants of the elites? I wonder. So here we have white supremacy as well in the Caribbean. So all of your complaints about your experiences in America does not make your oppression worse than everybody else. It does not. And it does not give you the right to be the only black. You're bugging. Next thing. Education and religion as control. Colonial schools taught European history, language, and culture while suppressing African and indigenous traditions. Christian missionaries often tried to erase African spiritual practices. And I believe that's a part of FBA complaint as well. And their call for reparations has to do with that type of oppression as well. Movement restrictions. Freed people in some colonies faced vagrancy laws and curfews, limiting their ability to move freely or form independent communities. Can y'all please hit that like button? Hit that like button. The like button will like you back if you hit the like button. So hit the like button, please. Just do it. All right, so the next form of oppression under colonialism, resistance and rise of nationalism. Despite these oppressions, Caribbean people resisted through peasant farming. Many freed people pooled money to buy land and establish independent farmlands, creating a foundation for economic survival. Labor movements. Workers organized strikes and unions, pushing for better wages and rights. Pan-African and nationalist movements. Leaders like Marcus Garvey of Jamaica, Aimé Césaire of Martinique, and later Eric Williams of Trinidad and Norman Manley of Jamaica helped build the road toward independence. You hear that? Did y'all hear that? Pan-African and nationalist movements. But right now I'm talking about the Pan-Africanist part. It says Pan-Africanism helped build the road towards independence for these Caribbean countries. Pan-Africanism. So when you continue to ask, what can Pan-Africanism show that is concrete? One thing that Pan-Africanism can make claim to is that they helped to build the road towards independence for these countries. Pan-Africanism was there. Where was FBA? And what independence did FBA gain? Where? Civil rights movement? Okay. But again, if we're talking about making comparisons, again, you got nothing over us, buddy. We got an independent country. Y'all got civil rights. So in summary, after slavery, Caribbean countries were still colonies trapped in dependency, politically ruled from abroad and denied rights, economically exploited for cheap labor and raw goods, culturally stripped of their heritage and forced into European molds. This is why many scholars say slavery ended, but colonial oppression simply took a new form until independence struggles succeeded in the mid-20th century. So can we say that slavery followed by colonialism in the Caribbean is on par with slavery followed by Jim Crow legacy in the Americas? Can we say they're on par? I mean, if I say they're on par, it's because I'm just trying to not. If I was, I think the slavery in the Caribbean was definitely worse. There's no debate about that. So the only thing we're putting on par is the colonialism and the Jim Crow stuff. Jim Crow, we could say, is dead. Colonialism, though, I don't know about all that. I don't know. But yes, I think if the slavery in the Caribbean can be seen as worse, then what followed the slavery in the Caribbean can also be seen as worse. But I'm going to say it's on par, at the very least. So, next question I asked ChatGPT. Let's see if ChatGPT likes this question. ChatGPT said, I asked ChatGPT, I said, was there any form of Jim Crow laws in the Caribbean? Was there any form of Jim Crow laws in the Caribbean? And it says, that's a really insightful question. I don't know if ChatGPT is trolling me, but no, it's a good question. Don't y'all think it's a good question? It's a good question. It says, that's a really insightful question. The Caribbean did not have Jim Crow laws in the exact way the U.S. South did. But there were similar systems of racial and social control under colonial rule. Instead of a formal legal code like Jim Crow, oppression came through colonial laws, economic policies, and social practices that maintained white dominance. So as certainly as there wasn't Jim Crow in the American North, but there was de facto Jim Crow in the North. And there was economic discrimination going on in the North. It wasn't labeled Jim Crow, but it was happening. It's the same way in the Caribbean. It wasn't called Jim Crow laws, but there were policies in place and practices in place that was about maintaining white supremacy. Legal restrictions, property and voting restrictions. After emancipation, voting rights were often tied to land ownership, income, or literacy. This included the majority of freed Black and mixed-race populations, much like Jim Crow disenfranchised Black Americans. That was Jim Crow. That was ChatGPT that said that. Next one. Vagrancy laws. Freed people could be arrested if they were unemployed or loitering, forcing many back into plantation labor at low wages. Vagrancy laws. Same as what was in the South. Same as what was here. Vagrancy laws. Curfews and pass systems. In some islands, restrictions on movement and curfews for Black populations resembled U.S. segregation controls. Look at that. Look at that. So what was going on in the Caribbean mirrors what was going on in America. Social segregation. And again, we're talking about Jim Crow type laws in the Caribbean. Social segregation, housing and public spaces. While not always codified, racial separation existed. White elites, white elites. Was that FBA? Is that talking about FBA when it says white elites? I don't know, maybe. White elites lived in segregated neighborhoods or estates, and Black populations were confined to poorer districts. Clubs and institutions. Many hotels, social clubs, and institutions excluded non-whites or imposed restrictions well into the 20th century. Marriage and social status. Informal but powerful norms discouraged interracial marriage or treated darker-skinned people as socially inferior. I mean, that's all the same thing that's written up as Jim Crow legacy in America. And given that throughout the Jim Crow era, given that after slavery ended and up throughout the Jim Crow era and up to even today, given that you had Blacks moving from the Caribbean to come here, it's clear that whatever was going on in the Caribbean was worse than what was going on here, because Blacks were having it better here. Certainly as they had it better during slavery here, they had it better here post-slavery, which is why Blacks in the Caribbean were moving here, because when they got here, they were treated just like the Blacks here were treated. They too were victims of white supremacy when they got here, and as they're still getting here. And as if we agree that white supremacy exists. If we agree that white supremacy is a real thing and that it exists, then what I am saying is all truth. And ChatGPT is here to back me up. Next, economic segregation, land ownership. Whites or lighter-skinned elites kept control of the best land and economic resources. And notice that they're separating the economic elites from just ordinary whites. Like FBA claimed to be not of the ordinary whites, they're of the elites. But whites or lighter-skinned elites kept control of the best land and economic resources. Black freed people were often pushed into small plots or forced to work as wage laborers. Job restrictions. Skilled or higher paying jobs often went to whites or light-skinned Creoles, while darker-skinned workers were relegated to low-wage plantation or manual labor. Number 4, comparison to U.S. Jim Crow. In the U.S. South, Jim Crow was explicit law, segregated schools, buses, bathrooms, drinking fountains, etc. In the Caribbean, racial control was more about colonial administration, plus class, hierarchy, and colorism. It was enforced by colonial laws, vagrancy and voting limits, and social exclusion rather than a codified segregation system. And again, as examples, it gives Jamaica, 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion. After this uprising, Britain clamped down on political rights, dissolving Jamaica's assembly and ruling directly through governors. Next, Trinidad and Guyana. The indentureship period. Systems of control divided Afro-Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean workers to weaken solidarity. Isn't that what they said happened with Bacon's rebellion They tried to weaken solidarity between the white indentured workers and the black workers and the black slaves. Isn't that what they said happened here? Even that happened in the Caribbean. They're like mirror images of each other. As certainly as we came from the same tribes in Africa, as certainly as we came from the same tribes in Africa, we experienced the same atrocities after slavery and during slavery. We experienced the same atrocities. In the Barbados and Bahamas, elites maintained whites-only clubs and schools went well into the 20th century. There were whites-only schools. And why wouldn't what's going on, what happened here, be happening in the Caribbean? Why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't they treat their slaves the same way during slavery and after slavery? Why wouldn't they? So summary, the Caribbean did not have Jim Crow laws in name, but colonial oppression functioned similarly, using voting restrictions, vagrancy laws, land control, color hierarchies, and social exclusion to maintain white supremacy long after slavery ended. ChatGPT offered to give me a comparison chart of Jim Crow versus colonial oppression. So Jim Crow US oppression versus colonial oppression in the Caribbean. So it gives an aspect, then Jim Crow and colonial. So the first aspect, political rights under Jim Crow, Black Americans disenfranchised through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. And in colonial Caribbean post-slavery, their voting was tied to property, income, and literacy. Most Black and working class populations were excluded. The next aspect, legal restrictions. Under Jim Crow, there were explicit segregation laws, schools, buses, bathrooms, public facilities. And in the colonial Caribbean, there were vagrancy laws, curfews, restrictions on movement, targeted freed Black people and poor laborers. The next aspect, social segregation. Under Jim Crow, whites and Blacks were forced into separate neighborhoods, schools, and public spaces. And in colonial Caribbean, informal segregation, social clubs, hotels, churches, and elite institutions often excluded non-whites. The next aspect, economic control. Under Jim Crow, whites dominated land, business, and skilled jobs. Sharecropping trapped many in poverty. In the Caribbean, land ownership concentrated in white or elite hands. Plantations and estates dominated the economy. The next aspect, cultural suppression. Under Jim Crow, African American history and culture was excluded from schools, and there was forced assimilation. Under colonialism, colonial schools prioritized European history, language, and culture. African traditions marginalized. And the last aspect, violence and repression. Under Jim Crow, there was lynching, racial terror and police repression, enforced white supremacy. And under colonialism, worker uprisings and rebellions violently suppressed. Example in Morant Bay, 1865, and the 1930s labor riots. So in short, says ChatGPT, the US South used explicit racial segregation laws like Jim Crow, while the Caribbean under colonialism relied on colonial law, plus economic control, plus social exclusion to achieve a very similar outcome, keeping the majority black population oppressed and politically powerless. I think that makes it pretty clear. That makes it pretty clear. And if it does not, I actually asked ChatGPT another question. I said, did banks in the Caribbean also discriminate during this time? Was there any form of redlining going on in the Caribbean? And it says yes. Banks in the Caribbean played a big role in reinforcing racial and class inequality during and after slavery. While there weren't always formal Jim Crow-style banking laws, discrimination happened through policies, access, and practices that kept black and working class people from building wealth. Number one, access to banking. Exclusion of freed blacks. In the 19th century, most banks were controlled by colonial governments, planters, or European merchant houses. Freed black people, who often had little collateral or land, were denied access to credit. Preference for whites and elites. Loans and financial services were extended mainly to white planters, merchants, and lighter-skinned elites who already owned land. And foreign-owned banks. Major banks were branches of British, French, or Dutch institutions. They prioritized serving colonial trade and plantation owners, not local populations. Number two, credit and loans. Land was collateral. Since freed blacks were largely landless after emancipation, they couldn't meet collateral requirements. This meant they had to rely on informal credit systems like SUSU, a rotating savings system that survives today in the Caribbean and diaspora. So all of these little things that we have in Jamaica, SUSU, when we draw partner. How many people out there know about being in a partner? All of these things are because of the legacy of colonialism, because we were locked out of, banking opportunities and getting credit and stuff like that. So we had to come up with these ways. So again, it says this meant they had to rely on informal credit systems like SUSU, a rotating saving system. Yeah, man, a rotating saving system. I get it this week. You get it next week. Every week, somebody else gets the pot. Next, high interest rates. When loans were offered to poorer or black populations, interest rates were often punitive, trapping borrowers in cycles of debt. And favoring plantation owners, banks offered credit to keep plantations running, ensuring the colonial economy and European profits continued, rather than supporting small farmers or local entrepreneurs. So again, man, all of this mirrors what was going on in America. Adding on Jim Crow and redlining and white supremacy and this and that, none of that makes what you did worse than what other Africans or other black people experienced. None of it makes you the best of the oppressed, the best oppressed. I mean, y'all be going for the weirdest titles. Y'all be going for the weirdest titles. Number 3, banking and racial or class hierarchy. Color and class bias. Even within the free population, lighter-skinned elites had better access to banking services than darker-skinned Afro-Caribbeans. Economic segregation. Black workers and peasants often had to pool money in community savings groups since formal institutions excluded them. barriers to entrepreneurship. Many Black-owned businesses face difficulty accessing startup capital, limiting upward mobility. Need I say more? Need I say more? There is something more we can say, and ChatGPT is going to say it. Number 4, long-term effects. The exclusion from formal banking preserved economic inequality long after slavery ended. Is that generational wealth? Is that what they're talking about? Generational wealth? Is that? It forced Afro-Caribbean communities to rely on alternative systems like SUSU, credit unions, and later cooperative banks, which became central to Black economic survival. Generational wealth. They were locked out of generational wealth. Hello? By the mid-20th century, nationalist leaders began pushing for indigenous banks and credit unions to break colonial control of finance. So in summary, Caribbean banks absolutely discriminated after slavery, not always by law, but by practice. They mainly served colonial trade and white elites, while excluding freed Black populations. This financial exclusion was just as damaging as political disenfranchisement because it kept the majority from building wealth or independence. It kept the majority from building wealth or independence. So when they tell you, as a Caribbean immigrant that comes here, when they tell you that the reason y'all come here and are able to do better is because you didn't have to deal with generational wealth, this lack of generating wealth over your generations, tell them to knock it off. Knock it off. We too were locked out of having generational wealth. But come here, and by the first generation, we start our generational wealth. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? I think that covers everything. Doesn't that cover everything? Like the video, no yacht? Yeah, wait, man. Like the video, yacht. Like the video. Last question I asked ChatGPT. Has there been any form of mass incarceration? So there was that other little piece, mass incarceration, because I do think mass incarceration is a part of the FBA HR 40 claim for reparations. So the next question, so I did leave something out. Long story short, I left something out. Mass incarceration. Has there been any form of mass incarceration in the Caribbean by colonial powers, is what I asked ChatGPT. And can you guess what it says? It says, yes. There were forms of mass incarceration in the Caribbean under colonial rule, though they look different from the U.S. prison industrial system. Instead of building giant penitentiaries, colonial authorities used prisons, jails, workhouses, and forced labor camps to discipline Black populations after slavery ended. These systems targeted rebellion, labor unrest, and unruly freed people. Need I say any more now? Okay, I'll say a little more. Number 1, criminalization after slavery. Vagrancy laws. Freed people without steady plantation jobs could be arrested for idleness or loitering. This criminalized poverty itself. Labor discipline. They said they criminalized poverty. Next thing, labor discipline. Colonial governments used prisons to force people back into plantation work when they resisted low wages. Next, high conviction rates for minor offenses. Petty crimes like stealing food, trespassing, or violating curfews were punished harshly. Not nicely, harshly. Number 2, prison conditions. Workhouses and penal labor. Prisoners were often forced into hard labor, road building, plantation work, dock work, essentially a continuation of slavery under a different name. Harsh punishments, whipping, shackling, and solitary confinement were common, especially in the 19th century. Overcrowding. By the late 1800s, many colonies saw rising prison populations as colonial powers relied more on incarceration to control freed Black communities. Would you look at that? Would you look at that? Ain't that something? Ain't that something? Next thing. Political imprisonment. Rebellion suppression. After uprisings like the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in 1865, thousands were arrested and many executed or imprisoned without fair trial. Labor protests. In the 1930s, mass strikes across Trinidad, Jamaica, and other inland islands led to mass arrests of union leaders and ordinary workers. Anti-colonial activists. Early nationalist and Pan-African leaders were monitored, jailed, and exiled by colonial authorities. Comparisons to mass incarceration. In the United States, mass incarceration exploded in the late 20th century with drug laws and policing targeting Black Americans. In the Caribbean, in the 19th and 20th century, colonial authorities relied on incarceration as a tool of racial control and labor discipline, not necessarily profit-making prisons. Still, the effect was similar, disproportionately criminalizing Black populations. Examples: Jamaica, after Morant Bay, over 400 people were executed and more than 1,000 imprisoned under martial law. In Barbados, in the 1876 Confederation riots, hundreds were jailed for resisting union with other islands. And in Trinidad in 1937, the Butler oil field riots, thousands were arrested as colonial authorities cracked down on labor unions. So in summary, says ChatGPT, yes, colonial powers in the Caribbean used mass incarceration as a tool of control. It wasn't identical to Jim Crow mass incarceration in the US, but prisons, vagrancy laws, and mass arrests after rebellions served the same function, keeping the majority Black population under political, economic, and social subjugation. So, post-slavery treatment, slavery treatment, and pre-slavery treatment, it was all the same. We all had the same experience. Our whole experience was similar. There's nothing experienced in America that wasn't experienced by everyone else in the diaspora. So there's nothing that makes the experience of FBA, the slavery experience of FBA, more unique than everyone else. You're not unique. You're not special. You're just like everyone else. You know? And the sooner we come to accept that, the sooner we can move on with our business, whatever that business is. We can move on with our business. Is that business going to be Pan-Africanism? No. No. I don't support that business that we move on to be Pan-Africanism. That's not my goal. You really want to be an American, your business should be to get on to being a good American. Stop trying to be a Black American, the only Black. Just be an American. Be a part of the American family. It's way more meaningful. Being a part of the American family is way more meaningful than being a part of the Black family, because being a part of the American family comes with rights, rights which are protected. Being a part of the Black family comes with no rights, nothing. It grants you no rights. It grants you nothing other than emotional stuff that you make up. Emotional stuff that you make up out of thin air. You just create an emotional connection to Africa. And if an emotional connection is what you need, then have that emotional connection with your country. It won't be any less made up than your emotional connection to Africa that other people want you to have, which I don't really want you to have. And if you are going to have an emotional connection to Africa, let me say this, if you are going to have an emotional connection to Africa, if you must, that's fine. But it must not overshadow or be greater than your emotional attachment to America, to your country. Because again, your country is what gives you the rights that you value. And your country is the ones that protect those rights that you value. So nothing should trump that. Nothing should trump that. So let's just get on with being good Americans. Let's get on with being good Americans. Certainly as Jamaicans are getting on with being good Jamaicans, get on with being a good American. Show them how to be a good American. Show me I'm not the only one with an American dream. I dare you. Show me your American dream is more of a paradise than mine. Show me you can dream an American dream bigger than I can. Dream an American dream bigger than any t'other's dream. Dream big. If you built this place, have a big American dream. How you built this place, but you're afraid to have an American dream. Didn't you have an American dream while you were building this place? Did you build this place with no dream in mind? You must have had an American dream while you were building this place, right? You would have to have had that. So go back to that. Go back to having that dream and live it. Live the dream that your ancestors dreamt. Live that dream. You'll be in a much better place. You'll be much happier.
I want you to listen very, very carefully.
Tell the youth them to be strong. You can't tell the youth them to preach wrongs. While you try it on these lands, just remember every man is equal. Yeah. Each one teach one, and a Father God, him a the only done. So make we reason, smoke trees, span the ends, all the deep meds. Take a look at life, and don't close your eyes. Sometimes things happen, and it's no surprise. And I just, so it go, so it go, so it go, so it go. It's the government, no have no heart, them no care about poor people. Yeah, bigger heads no love people again. Them most than little of them. Me see friends now reason again. Vex through whistle a blame. More time it hurt me to see how the face deal with the eagle of them. Regular me see it a pain. Regular me see it a pain. Take a look at life and don't close your eyes. Sometimes things happen and it's no surprise. And I just, so it go, so it go, so it go, so it go. It's the government, no have no heart, them no care about poor people. Social commentary. Drop that one, your principle, you don't know. The global will come and do it. Some people life every day, it's stress. The high price from JPS, that topic is currently. Jah alone, him a go help you. We need food, cause we no healthy. We are feel the pain, beg you protect we. In our life, we have no envy. Take a look at life, and don't close your eyes. Sometimes things happen, and it's no surprise. And I just, so it go, so it go, so it go, so it go. It's the government, no have no heart, them no care about poor people.